Lauri Lahikainen. I'm a philosopher in Tampere University in Finland, and I'd like to thank the Rachel Carson Center for inviting me to give this talk, and especially the students there who I'm told were decided to invite me. My topic is Environmental Philosophy for Cities, the Case of Climate Change and Responsibility. And it's based on my research project on cities, climate change and collective responsibility, where I'm trying to philosophize about cities as the sort of agents that have responsibilities regarding climate change, whether they are retrospective responsibilities, whether it makes sense to blame cities for our climate problems, or whether they are prospective responsibilities. That is, what kind of duties do cities have for the mitigation of climate change, for adaptation, for making sure that whatever effects there are about climate change, that they will not be completely unjust. There is a big discussion going on in public life and in various scientific disciplines on what exactly the role of cities is vis-a-vis climate change. Some have gone even so far as to suggest that cities are the agents that will be able to save the planet. One reason for thinking like this is that states have apparently not been quite as responsible as we would have hoped. There have been lots of negotiations, but not enough action, whereas cities have often been much more ambitious in their climate change goals and in their mitigation efforts than the states wherein they are. But there are lots of philosophical questions related to climate change in cities, especially about, concerning responsibilities. So how can cities actually be responsible for climate change? What kind of entities, what kind of things are cities? Are they the sort of entities that are concepts of responsibility attached to them? Does it make sense to praise or blame them? And related questions relate to city dwellers themselves. Do city dwellers have a duty to mitigate climate change just in virtue of where they live? Or how should city dwellers respond to the efforts of their cities for climate change mitigation? When we say that cities are mitigating climate change, who are we referring to when we talk about those cities? A project like this is obviously interdisciplinary in many ways, but I'm drawing on research in climate ethics, that is philosophical discussion on the ethical problems of climate change, on philosophical theories of collective responsibility, because cities are kind of collective entities. There's an ongoing, a new sort of field called philosophy of the city that is related to philosophical questions about cities, which is obviously relevant to me. And also I'm drawing on interdisciplinary urban studies and sociology of cities, and I'm doing, of course, as a philosopher, mostly philosophical analysis, but I'm also doing some empirical work with colleagues from social sciences. You can read more about the project from my website. So, can cities be responsible for climate change? I think in public discussions the assumption is that yes, of course they can. And indeed we can say that there is some kind of causal responsibility. In philosophy of responsibility we can differentiate between moral responsibility and causal responsibility. Causal responsibility doesn't yet mean that someone is responsible in a moral sense, but it's often required for it. So cities account for more than 70% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. They account for an estimated 50% of global waste and are home to nearly half of the world's population, according to OECD and the United Nations and other similar organizations have similar estimates. So it seems that that even if cities are not completely causally responsible for climate change, that they are indeed causally responsible for a pretty big chunk of it. But can cities do something about it? Well, what can cities do? Well, cities can decrease their own emissions. For example, they can affect things like heating. Often heating is somehow centrally organized. They can plan their cities differently. They can affect transportations by city planning. They can build infrastructure. They can destroy infrastructure. They can invest in infrastructure. But cities can maintain and create carbon sinks as well. So there can be city parks. In Finland, cities often own forests or wildlife areas. And cities can help or even force other agents, like both in the individual and collective, to decrease their emissions. And cities can take part in innovating scalable infrastructural, political, cultural, and socio-ecological ways of doing things differently. So I think there are many ways that cities can affect climate change. And in many ways, cities can be more kind of agile agents than states. But what can we say about moral responsibility of cities? And I take it for granted that cities are collective agents in the sense that they comprise of many agents like city dwellers and different organizations, and obviously the city bureaucracy and government. So according to, I think, most philosophers who've discussed collective responsibility, they agree that an agent can be morally responsible if it is capable of intentional action, and if it is internally and externally free, meaning that they can make decisions, they can have plans, they can intend to do things, so they do not just do whatever randomly, but they form intentions and then act according to them. And they are free in the sense that they are not determined by their own, internally, that is, they are not determined by their own kind of essential features, and they are externally free in the sense that nobody is forcing them to do everything that they do. Of course, that is to a reasonable extent, because no one is free of any outside influence, and we are not ever completely in control of ourselves, of course. So it's a matter of degree. But in order for a collective agent, for example, a corporation or a state or a non-governmental organization or a group of friends or whatever, they need to have a decision-making procedure. So one way or another, they are organized in such a way that they can make decisions, they can form collective intentions, so to speak, and that they can take into account moral reasons in their decision making. So if a collective can make decisions according to financial calculations, but is simply somehow unable to take into account whether their actions harm or benefit people, then we wouldn't praise or blame that sort of entity, even though we might decide that it's a bad idea to have collective entities like that in our society. But we wouldn't hold the entity itself responsible. Do cities meet these requirements? Well, it seems that they do. Cities have intentions, they can make roadmaps, they can make strategies, they can make budgets, which express their intentions, and in a sense they are themselves intentions. And in a way we can actually be more sure that cities are intentional because they write their intentions down in documents, which individual human beings do not do. It's a hard question whether and to what extent cities are free, Obviously, they are subject to all sorts of structural constraints, but that is true for all agents. So I don't think that cities are less free necessarily than individuals or even states. They might be free in different ways. They have different kinds of actions available to them, but they are not unfree in the sense of being completely determined by internal or outside forces. And cities have decision-making procedures. They have councils, bureaucracies, voting mayors. They have city workers, city managers, and there are less formal structures like, say, experiments and participatory decision-making where city dwellers are involved. And it seems that they can take into account moral reasons in their decision-making procedures. If you look at, there are, for example, my hometown, my home city, Tampere, has videos about council meetings. So you can see what kind of things are discussed, what kind of reasons are given for action. And moral reasons are often discussed in various ways. City dwellers, if they can vote, if they elect their city officials, they may have moral reasons for voting who they vote for. Normative, if you look at the city strategies, for example, you can see that there are normative concepts that are used in them, like duty or goodness or welfare. So it seems that cities are able to take moral reasons into account. So maybe the project is kind of ready. It's finished. Cities can be responsible for climate change. They meet the requirements for responsible agents. But I think there are reasons to look further. I don't think that cities are equal to their decision-making structures. And I don't think that cities, the decision-making structures of cities is the sort of thing that makes them the city that they are. For example, Andrew Bell and Avner Deshalit talk about the spirit of the city in their book called The Spirit of Cities, where they talk about New York being a city of ambition or Jerusalem being a city of religion. It's an interesting book, and I'm not sure if I agree with them in anything, but the main thing is that they don't much discuss about how the cities are organized in terms of decision making. What they think that what is important about cities is something else entirely, and that spirit, what they call the spirit of the city, is not a result of decision by a city council, but it's something else. It's something that's been a result of a complex history. And in this sense, cities are a bit different than, at least if you think about the philosophy of history, where philosophers often thought that humans are humans because they are rational. But we don't think about this about cities, I think. We can disagree, of course, about whether the essence of humans is their rationality. But just if we are talking, if we are within a certain tradition of thought and using the tools of that tradition, then it seems that there is at least kind of discrepancy between cities as collective agents and individual human beings. And we can also ask about city dwellers. What is it that makes their city the sort of city that it is? I haven't done empirical research on this. I think some people are probably, but I would be surprised if if, for example, my neighbors thought that what makes Tampere the kind of city that it is because it has the organizational structure that it is. If you disagree, I'm interested to hear why. And as I said in the beginning, in my project, I'm drawing on different kind of theories of the city, both from sociology and urban studies and for philosophical theories. And in these theories, it's not usually the formal organization or the decision-making procedure of the city that is discussed. usually it's something else, or I mean, it can be discussed, but it's not something that is sort of defining feature of the city. So, for example, Max Weber wrote in his book about the city. He started it by lamenting that there is little agreement on what actually a city is. So he wrote that the many definitions of the city have only one element in common, namely that the city consists simply of a collection of one or more separate dwellings, but is relatively closed settlement. Much later, an environmental ethicist, Andrew Light, wrote that cities are physical manifestations of our values and priorities. An geographer, Mark Whitehead, wrote that cities are the spatial manifestations of complex economic and political processes, including property markets, global financial flows, coalitions of political interest, gentrification, and labor migrations that shape and condition the urban experience in different cities. So they can be manifestations of something, whether you have the sort of more idealistic picture like Andrew Light, or if you have the sort of more materialist understanding like Max Whitehead, then in any case it seems that there are all sorts of forces at work that make cities the kind of things that they are. But the formal city organization may be one of those forces, but it's certainly not the only one, and it might not be the defining one. And of course we could go further. There's a long tradition of talking about cities in modern thought, and obviously I'm still very much in the process of reading that stuff, but it doesn't seem to me that sort of formal organizational features of the city are the central focusing in the tradition of urban thought generally. Philosopher of the city, Shane Epting, has been thinking about the ontology of the city and has this very abstract definition that the identity of a city is all of the parts that a city has at any given time and how these parts fit and work together, bearing in mind that the parts continuously change. Considering that a city continuously changes its composition throughout time, through adding or subtracting parts, describing its composition as dynamic seems fitting. So we can think that cities are kind of processual, they are dynamic, they are polyphonic, they are made up of many parts, and these parts themselves change, and there may be different kinds of parts through time. But where is agency in all this? It seems that if you take these theories of cities, then the question of the responsibility of the city becomes pretty difficult. It seems that they are manifestations of forces, but are they manifestations that are actual agents? Are they the sort of things that we could praise or blame or say that has a duty to mitigate climate change? Or is it just that we as agents intervene in these processes trying to change the city so that it, say, emits less CO2? And it's an open question. But I think it leads to a problem that I call the Tale of Two Cities problem, referencing the book by Dickens. So we can have the city as an organization, and that fits pretty well with the theories of collective responsibility. But we can have the city as a dynamic processual entity, a manifestation of forces, and we can have the city as a whole. And this is the kind of city that is very difficult to think of as an entity that has collective intentions, that can actually decide to do something about climate change, and whether it does or does not decide to do that, we can praise or blame it. So can I say that Tampere itself, for its part, obviously not completely, but can I say that Tampere is responsible for climate change? And not just that the city organization is responsible, saying that the city organization, we can define it in different ways, but it would be something like that in Tampere it would be the council, the mayor, the city managers, and the laws and norms that govern their interaction. How to get away from this tale of two cities if we think that it's a problem. Obviously, we could just say that, okay, let's not blame cities, let's just blame, or let's not praise cities, or let's not say that cities are responsible, only that their city organization are. But I think this is not an interesting answer. There are other reasons not to like this answer, but I can't go through them here. But I think one kind of proposal that I'm pretty uncertain of, but I'm trying to think about it further, is that we could expand the decision-making process, or rather expand our understanding of it, but possibly also expand it in actual politics. So we could go both ways. So we could not just look at formal organization, but we could look at social movements within the city. We can look at informal discussion with neighbors, schools and cultural activities, even non-human elements as infrastructures, and try to see whether they could be parts in the decision-making procedure. Another way to look at it is to take Shane Epting's proposal of the ontology of the city as a dynamic process of different parts interacting together, and see how decision-making processes, or how different parts of that process are elements in decision-making, and see what kind of whole or an entity they form. It seems that all these elements do make a difference in decision-making. So social movements can affect what the organization does. Discussion with neighbors affects how I vote. Schools and cultural activities affect who meets whom and who interacts with whom. And even non-human elements do influence how city dwellers live together and how they end up thinking of the thoughts that they do. And they also include much more points of intervention for city dwellers who want to have a say or affect what the city does, if we do not just think about the city as its formal organization. And finally, I think that we shouldn't probably try to make as complete a list as possible, but rather maintain a kind of inclusive and open attitude towards decision making. So let's take an example. This is a sort of philosophical example in the sense that it's not any real city, but it's actually based on empirical work. So I worked in a couple of interdisciplinary projects where I've had access to empirical information, and I've even done some interviews myself. So I would say that what I here call City C is something of a combination of different Finnish cities, and I believe that similar kind of things you could see elsewhere in the world. So there's a decision-making procedure in this city. They have city councils, they have city bureaucracies, they have strategic executives, but they also have, so this is an expanded kind of procedure, they have environmental experts, risk analysts, tables, negotiation rooms, budgets, strategies, roadmaps, votes, and so on. So it's a kind of expanded look on the procedure. And moral reasons enter into this procedure, moral reasons about climate change enter into this procedure in specific phase. So there are environmental experts whose job it is to kind of have the expertise about climate change and what the city can do about it. So they carry knowledge and moral reasons about it, and they introduce it to the decision-making procedure. But there are also some experimental workshops of participatory planning where citizens are involved, and there are maybe there are some kind of virtual ways to to gather the opinions of citizens more generally. There are some problems regarding climate change policies in this procedure, however. The environmental experts, who are the main carriers of moral reasons about climate change and knowledge, are not invited into the highest levels of strategic and financial decision making. They are in other meetings, of course, but not in the meetings where the actual strategic thinking is going on or where budgets are decided. And when preparing the budget itself, and the budget has the kind of final say on what the city does with its resources. So it's a terribly important document. When preparing the budget, financial reasons are kind of trump cards. They will override any moral considerations. If there's no money, it doesn't matter that we have strong moral reasons to mitigate climate change, and that's the end of discussion. And the city clearly has intentions on doing something about climate change and biodiversity and other such problems. They exist as intentions in roadmaps and strategic documents even, but not in the budget. So there's a barrier between those kinds of intentions. In other words, moral reasons and morally relevant knowledge exists. There's possibility for taking them into account, but they are not. And there are ways how moral reasons, there are barriers that make moral reasons not a part of the decision-making procedure from beginning to the finish. Right. So I think in this sort of situation we can say that the way the city is organized is such that there are barriers between moral reasons and the actual decisions, but we could still criticize the city for having these sort of barriers, because they could be otherwise. The city is free to change the way it operates. They could decide that actually we need to discuss climate change in the budget meeting. They could decide that actually, since we intend to do something about climate change, it is in the roadmap, it is in the strategy, so it needs to be in the budget. There's no deep structural reason for not having this, for these structural barriers. So I think in this sense we could say that suppose then that this imagined but I think pretty realistic city does continue to fail to take climate change into account, then we could say that it's actually morally blameworthy as a city. We could blame the city organization as one of the kind of main culprit, but I think we could say that we could do more research on what actually happens in different levels of decision making. So why should we kind of expand the decision making procedure? One thing is that we could actually have a tale of one city, in the sense that we could say that the city as a whole has responsibilities, and we can retain the sort of intuition that collective moral agents require morally informed decision making capacity. But at the same time, we can have an ontology of the city that is informed by social scientific research in cities. And this makes it possible to have more interdisciplinary research between environmental ethicists, social ontologists, and social scientists. And there could be new avenues for environmental philosophy about cities more generally. But there are also some practical implications. So if we take a more inclusive look at how deliberation and decision making happen on many levels, and how taking these different levels into account in a transparent and inclusive way might improve the way the city makes decisions, because it might often be the case, as in the case of the city that I talked about, it might be the case that moral reasons are discussed in the sort of lower levels of decision making, but they somehow do not end up in the higher levels of decision making, if the city is organized in such a way that there are these kinds of levels, metaphorically speaking. It's also a way to decrease alienation and antagonism between the city dwellers and the city organization, because it might often be the case that the city dwellers themselves do love their own city, they might be proud of it, but at the same time they might not feel the same way about city politics. But taking a more expansionist look on how the city actually operates as a whole, and in what levels we could find parts of a decision-making procedure. So this sort of expansionist process might be a way to decrease this alienation. And a sort of important practical implication is that we could try to make sure that there are avenues for moral reasons and relevant knowledge and expertise to enter into deliberation and decision-making on all levels, especially when we are talking about high-stakes questions such as climate change. And we should make sure that there are no mechanisms that trump moral reasons in any part of the city where decision-making is going on. So in that sense, we make the city more ethical by making sure that moral discussion and moral reasons are happening in pretty much everywhere. There are obviously open questions, so what things should count as parts of the decision-making process? How do we find out? Case by case. But if we look at a particular case, how do we know? What kind of implications are there for city dwellers? I think one interesting way is to see whether there could be a kind of new sense of agency and responsibility in these times where I think people are anxious to have an effect on climate change. So maybe activism on the city level might be a way for many people who are worried about climate change to make a difference. Then we can ask what is it actually like to blame a city? Does it make sense? And I think in some cases it makes sense to blame the whole city. Sometimes we can blame some parts of the decision-making process, and sometimes we can blame both. Obviously, one question is that does it make sense to speak of the city as an entity at all, because there are so many different kinds of cities around the world. And of course, how to account for social and political struggles within the cities, because my framework for expanding the decision-making procedure might make it look like that that cities are some kind of ideal democratic places, which is often not the case. But to say something more general at the end, it would say that so what would environmental philosophies for cities be about? The main title in this talk is that it's philosophical investigation of cities as a form of human and non-human relationships, and all forms of philosophy can be environmental philosophy about cities. But in terms of responsibility, the sort of most abstract definition would be that environmental philosophy of cities, in terms of responsibilities, but how we live together and how our mode of living together in cities acquires causal powers, and how that can acquire agential powers. So how can we, in a sense, be responsible for our cities by making the cities the sort of entities that are collective responsible agents, and what these powers should be like and how we govern and use them. Okay, I will stop here, but thank you again for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.